making sure that the YouTube thing is working. It wasn't working, but I've got it working now for the folks that are there.
Cool.
Cool. Okay. So I'll do a proper introduction. One thing that might help too, because later on we may bring people up to do comments and stuff like that and hang out, is could you make Lee and I moderators? Because I think you
Yeah,
started the
sure.
room, and so you've got the badge
Make
of
them
honor.
You've got the
moderator.
power.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll make you moderators.
Well, thank
You
you.
guys are now the moderators.
I appreciate it. Okay, cool. So let's get it started. Thanks so much everyone for being here. Whether you're on Clubhouse or on YouTube, this is Means of Creation. It's a conversation that we have every week with someone who's really fascinating, just working in kind of the world of content creators and platforms that facilitate that content creation and the technologies and the businesses that are sustaining it. And so we're just incredibly excited to have Sam here today. Sam and I go way back. I remember when I pitched you and you called me a hipster and you said I wasn't focused on building a business,
Oh
which
my
was true.
gosh, was this
You
for
saw into my
hardbound?
soul. Yeah, this was for hardbound.
Well, I wasn't. Was I
No.
wrong?
No, you were correct. You're 100% correct. You saw into my soul, like I said, and honestly, probably still are correct in a lot of ways. But it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed that conversation that we had, just like as a one-off, like whatever startup founder pitching an investor. And then I've just been such a fan of your work ever since. So Sam, for people who don't know, led the product group at Facebook called, what is it? People, Places, and Things. It's all the nouns, right?
Yeah, I held the nouns.
And did that for kind of a really critical period of time in Facebook. That was from before Facebook was public, right? And then through a couple years after the IPO.
Yep,
So
exactly.
a really fascinating time in Facebook's history. Sam is the general partner at Slow Ventures, which invests in a lot of amazing companies, I think including Clubhouse, right?
Yeah, we're tiny investors in Clubhouse.
Right. Me too.
We all are.
Got 5K in. And that's like my one and only angel investment. So I've got a decent track record so far. And also the co-founder and CEO of Fin, which basically does time and motion studies of for organizations, like kind of optimizing if people are doing frontline work, where it's like, is it like mostly customer support, or what are the kind of key things where people may want to measure? Yeah.
Here's the quick thing on Fin is, like, again, one of the parts of my career I usually jump over is I actually started my career at Bain & Company. Optimizing like factory lines and stuff like that was pretty fun. And, it's interesting. If you look at the physical world of manufacturing, everything's so instrumented and optimized. It's pretty interesting. And then you flip around and look at like how knowledge workers do things, and it's like shockingly uninstrumented, right? Like you're like, well, where did my day go? Where is time going? So we basically built it's basically a new relic for people, where we basically instrument second by second exactly what people are doing across applications to complete work, and then we use that to basically figure out how to optimize, effectively process and tools and people for customer service and back office and things like that. I really believe that, like, you can't optimize what you haven't measured properly. And it's like basic human knowledge work is still shockingly unmeasured. So that's what we've been doing. It was me and Andrew Cortina, who is the founder of Venmo, have been working on that for a while as well.
Fascinating. I love it. So we've got that. And then also we've got the thing that I'm probably the biggest fan of yours for is your columns in the information. And I'm curious here, maybe as a jumping off point, not a lot of tech founders and CEOs really like think of their work like a column. I think there's a lot of people who write every once in a while, right? Like they publish on Medium maybe, or they tweet. But I think the information provides this platform that's a really different kind of platform, and I think for your writing. And I'm curious, just like as a jumping off point, like how did you end up, like, what's the story behind Modest Proposals? And what has it been like over the years writing a regular column, like, for like the new version of like a newspaper?
Oh, yeah. So I think like I, many years ago, just came to the conclusion that like writing was very important discipline. I think it's really easy to like deceive yourself about your own ideas or thoughts later. You're like, that's how I was thinking about this or whatever.
Yeah.
I also find that like writing is like, in conversations, it's very easy to kind of do yada, yada, yada and skip over points or not really think through your points. Whereas like if you actually have to write it down and put it in front of people, there's like a certain level of like, I need to actually think this through. So I started a long time writing for myself. And like many people, I started writing a blog. This is probably like in 2005. And then interestingly, in about 2008, I actually hilariously, given where the world has now gone, started a thing called Letterly. And Letterly was.
I remember this.
Remember Letterly?
Yeah. Well, I remember being early at Substack and somebody was like, hey, there was a thing that was like this.
Yeah. So I started thinking it was kind of like proto Substack, right? Like it was a paywall in front of an email newsletter service. We had a few hundred people writing on it. Actually did really well. I had a few hundred, we were doing like millions of dollars in top line, but like I basically started writing letterlies, which mine was called Modest Proposals. Like the joke being that like, they really weren't that modest. Like that's the joke of Modest Proposals is they're really not modest at all. Right.
Right. Also connected to the original Modest Proposal. Essay, yeah, right? Exactly.
One of the greatest pieces of writing ever. Right. So I was doing that for a while. When I went to Facebook, I did stop writing because I just was like honestly too busy. And also like when you work at a place like Facebook, it's pretty hard to like have like honest public opinions. Not that like people don't have good thoughts and the people there are awesome. It's just like it's kind of like too high stakes in a lot of ways. But when I left Facebook, I went back to writing. My wife at that time was just starting information. And so I kind of wanted, she basically let me take that as an where like I was the only one who wasn't a serious journalist writing serious news. I got to like kind of write my opinion column once a week or so. And so I've kept that up and it's been really fun. I really enjoy writing. I really believe in it. So that's the kind of the short story.
Yeah, it's really good. There's been so many cases over the last few months where I'll send one of your columns to Nathan and I'll be like, we need to get Sam on the show and talk about this. Like, I have so many thoughts about this. And now you're finally here. And I think it's probably been like ever since week 2 of the show where I first did that. And so I'm glad we were able to make this happen. And maybe to kick it off, I'd love to talk about your most recent column. I think it just came out today. It's about Clubhouse and the movement towards cult-driven social platforms rather than community-driven social platforms.
Yeah.
And well, actually, I'd love to just have you first maybe start by summarizing the piece for those in the audience who maybe haven't read it yet or aren't subscribers.
Haven't been indoctrinated yet, maybe.
Yeah.
Haven't drank the Kool-Aid yet.
Yeah, fair enough. So look, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously I've followed social networking from the earliest days and like, both working at Facebook and, helping Venmo in the early days and things like that. I think the thing that I think if you've been around since the beginning of the internet, there's been this shift, right? Where like early on in the internet, there was this like very strong community vibe. And let me define what I mean by a community. A community is a place where you go somewhere and you're really interested in what every other person in the space has to say, right? Like you want to hear their stories and their thoughts. And like, thinking out why that was, it was because like, look, there weren't that many people on the internet, right? It was pretty hard to find affinity groups. Like it wasn't like everything was super open. So if you found your way to like your community, like, you're really into like cats and knitting or whatever. You're like, whoa, it's amazing. There are like other people who also like cats and knitting. And like, I wonder what they have to say. It was like a very magical experience. I also think like for cultural reasons, as well as the fact there just wasn't enough content, the whole role of like moderating, like if you think about like, I started the space, it's like people had this like very hands-off approach. Like you did have moderators, but they were like really leaned back. Maybe they kind of like policed extreme cases. I think what's happened in the broad sweep of history is like being controlling digital spaces has gotten really high value, like in the practical real world. Like it's high prestige, but it's also like you make a lot of money doing it. Like there's all these pressures that like drive it up. There are now tons of people on the internet, right? Like everyone's competing for attention, right? All of a sudden because of that. It's no longer super magical to find people like you because they're just like everyone's on the internet, right? And there's just a huge amount of pressure. And I think what's happened is like kind of under our noses is like there's been this switch from what I call like community spaces into like cults, right? And what cults in my mind are like, you're not actually there for the other people, right? You're there for the leader, right? For whoever's in charge. And like, what I think has been super cool, I think what Clubhouse is like an incredible example of this. Like it's an awesome cult platform. It has like all the hallmarks of like what a cult looks like. Like there's a stage of leaders, like we're the leaders right now. And like people listening, right? And like, there's this cool, it's very powerful, like social capital exchange where like, instead of being like a backgrounded moderator, you guys are like the moderators and you get to choose who gets on stage and who gets to speak. And like everyone in the room can kind of like be listening and like, they kind of want to be there, but like, it's like a big deal to get called on maybe, right? And so like there's this, it's almost like a church or like a synagogue, right?
Totally.
And then like you get
in like really a front row, and we all know the people that had like the front row seats at church like every Sunday or whatever. Like it's
right. And like and then there's like there's like this whole dynamics around being blessed and promoted, and then there's actual real value in that. Like someone gets on stage and says something super smart and they get a bunch of followers, like they can build their own cult. And so there's all this like formality of like leadership and following and social capital exchange in the context of rooms. And like, I just, again, like, even like you look at like in the last few weeks, like Chamath and Elon, who are like clearly cult leaders. Let's be really honest. Like that's like what they do, like kind of between platforms. I just think there's this like systemic shift going on, which is understandable and rational. Like I don't think there's anything like nefarious about it. It's just happening, right? And I think Clubhouse has a bunch of really interesting social. I mean, even like how you guys do like repeated events and ritual. Like ritual is a really big part of cults, right? So you just see kind of this shift from community to cult that I think is super interesting.
Yeah, the part of this that I want to dig into is whether this is new on the internet or not, because I was reflecting back on some of like the early social networking platforms and the early blogging platforms, and although they weren't designed so explicitly with this like follower leader dynamic in mind, they still did have culty dynamics to them, I believe. Like there were influential users on internet platforms who everyone listened to and like would upvote when they made a comment, or there were really influential blogs that everyone read, even though everyone else also had a blog.
Totally. And I don't want to like overpaint it. Like I don't want to overfit it. It's not like it's, I mean, there are protocols, right? There are things that have kind of evolved over time. It's like, you know, Twitter has a bunch of super culty characteristics to it, right? Obviously, you know, TikTok and Instagram do, like there's an evolution. My point is only that I think you've seen like, if you had to categorize, so everyone likes to talk about like social as like a single category, and it's not. I think if you think about like community versus cult platforms, and I do think there's been broadly a shift away from communities and towards cults. It's like, you know, like communities now, it's like you get on like a Discord group or like a Slack group or like some thread and messaging, and it's just like, I find them like incomprehensible, right? Because they're just like
too much noise.
They're too noisy, and so like there's this like natural gravitation where it's like, I need a preacher, I need like someone we all agree to follow, right? And there's actually recently value in that.
It's like a focal point. A focal point sort of like allows people to get in the funnel a lot more easily. There's like, you can kind of get a handle on, oh, this person's speaking and I find what they're saying to be interesting. And so I can connect to other people through that rather than connecting to a bunch of other people directly where there's no clear focal point. And so you just, it's like cacophony.
Or it's like we all, like as long as we all agree to follow the same person, like take like what's going on with like Wall Street bets, but then like Dogecoin and Elon. It's like, I was joking the other day, it's like Elon now can just be like, say something cryptic, and whoever sees it first makes a bunch of money. Right. So you have all these disciples running around, right? And like, just because of the dynamic, because everyone's decided to follow Elon like in this set, and like they all have their Robinhood accounts open. It's like, if you happen to catch his tweet first, you can make some money, right? Really quickly, right? And so I think like this is this interesting dynamics about how cult leaders can like reward their disciples, and how like disciples can like demonstrate fealty effectively, and like this follower-followee relationship, which I think, again, it's not that it didn't exist before. It's not that it didn't happen. It's just gotten like so intense and instant. And I think that's just the direction we're heading in right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you think the implications are for social platforms and the technology businesses that are enabling these cults? Because it kind of maybe suggests that the leverage is shifting to the cult leaders rather than to the platforms, and maybe the network effects aren't as strong anymore.
So it's a great question. It's actually what I've been spending a huge amount of personal time on right now, is like thinking through exactly this. And like, I'm very interested in influencer driven businesses right now, right? And like the influencer ecosystem, you know, I'm starting to like think about funding influencers directly, actually, even beyond their businesses. We can get into like influencers and influencer businesses are a little bit different, but like, you know, actually the first company I ever tried to start in my entire life when I was in high school, like literally sitting on the payphone in like the cafeteria, was like investing directly in people. And it's a thread I followed my whole career, like done a lot of ISA investing, things like this. But like, yeah, I think you're totally right. There's gonna be more and more power concentrated on people and on cult leaders versus on platforms. I also think, like, candidly, from a platform design perspective, if you're trying to build a really successful platform, make it something that cult leaders can use. Like that's almost your most important constituent. They'll bring the masses, right?
Yeah.
If you can design it really well. That I think is like, again, this isn't a criticism of Clubhouse. I think Clubhouse is great, but I think like that's what Clubhouse is really nailing right now. You know, for legacy platforms that are community driven, like, look, I think there are interesting questions to ask about, like, if you're Facebook's groups team, what do you do? Right? Like, it's not that there aren't Facebook groups that are vibrant. There are some that are interesting, like there are some things where like scale matters, like, you know, you're trying to buy and sell shit or whatever. But like, if the energy is going away from like the passive moderator who curates, a group of people of similar interest and into just like cult platforms, like there are product design decisions that matter, right? About how you design things to be engaging. And then there's a question of like, you can lean into cults, or you can think really hard about how to evolve communities to be like a counterweight or like make them more viable. Like if you think about even human history, it's like obviously oversimplifying. Humans started in small communities, right? Probably had local, everyone kind of knew each other, whatever. New technology evolves, writing, like, the wheel, whatever. We can get into what mattered, right? And all of a sudden you have like cults, right? Like religious cults, like, monarchies, like authoritarian governments. In the last few hundred years, we kind of figured out democracy, which kind of pushes back on some cults, maybe not all, but like we figured out like in the physical world, like some meta structure that's more inclusive and has more power. Like a good democracy is going to have more power than like a cult. The question is in digital space, like what is the equivalent of that? Like how do you create leverage in large aligned populations around values or rules, right? To push back against cults.
The thing that's so fascinating about that analogy of like governance to sort of like online communities or cults is, in the physical world, it's extremely difficult to exit. Like all your family and friends are there. You'd have to like travel. You'd probably die on your own in the wilderness or whatever. Like, whereas online, there's like a huge amount of choices. So it's almost like the libertarian dream of like sort of like select your government easily on a menu from like all the options and sample one. And if you don't like it, you can leave and go to another one. And instead of providing basic foundational stuff like the government, it's just providing like whatever tickles your interest, And so it's kind of like a lot lower stakes too in some ways, but you do build relationships and identity and worldviews through there, and you participate in collective action in these groups. So there are real implications.
I think it's actually more serious than that, honestly, for what it's worth, which is like, I agree with you that like that is the difference. Like you can, there's no friction online. You can just go to another. But here's the problem. I think if you look on like 100-year scale, I think one of the biggest problems we're going to have is figuring out how to keep people engaged in reality, right? Like fantasy, especially if you can pick your own fantasy, especially with VR and where we're going, is going to be so much more appealing than like reality for most people. And the problem is that if most people just like opt out of reality and into these like fantasy worlds, like look, as long as they can like trade random shit and like, do GameStop things, it's like there's all sorts of collective action that's powerful. But like I think it's a pretty big, like deep human problem, right? Like if we just all kind of fracture and go in our own directions long term. And like, there's a great, I think is it Robert Frost? There's a great poem. Maybe you guys remember. It's very famous about will the world end in fire or ice, right? And it's basically like, we're going to end up like all coming to a point and just getting. I mean, you can think about it as physics. Like we're going to get, the big crunch or like whatever the opposite of the big crunch is, where everything kind of
heat death of the universe.
The heat death or cool death of the universe. And like this poem is about that, but I think you can also think about it on social terms, which is like the hot death of the world is like we shrink everything to a pinpoint, right? The whole world, 7 billion people end up all arguing online in this tiny space, and they all hate each other, right? Because like it turns out you just have too much pressure in too little space. Or you have the cool death, where everyone opts into their own VR future, where like they're the hero of the story, or like they're in their own weird little cult, and if they don't like it, they pick a different cult, and like they have no real connection to the rest of humanity. Both of these are bad, right? And so the question is like in digital space, what do we do? Like, how do we create spaces that are going to stand, right? That actually like hold together humanity in like a productive way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is kind of reminiscent of the topic of your column a few months ago called, I think, the societal problem of 1,000 true fans, talking about the implications of the 1,000 true fan model, or I've sometimes talked about the 100 true fan model, which takes it a step further, where it's an even more small micro community of true fans that creators can have. Nathan and I have also had this discussion in terms of like, is the subscription content model, is it good for society if everyone is just subscribing to the things that they're willing to pay for and probably corroborate their views and no one else can consume that content? I think the counter argument to this being a societal problem is, I think people are able to be in lots of different sizes of communities. They can find their niche online. They can be part of 100 true fans of someone. But I think there's also the possibility of that going hand in hand with being part of a much larger, like national or city-wide community of being, fans of a sports team or something like that. And it's not mutually exclusive to be part of a small tribe and a large tribe all at the same time. And I think overall, the proliferation of niche communities online, I think of it as a good thing, because I would argue that it just used to be the case that we were much lonelier before, not that we were more unified before.
I mean, look, I think basically the extremes of all these things are challenging for humanity. Like, we're used to having natural frictions in the physical world that like causes us to like be pretty moderate overall, and like the internet just allows extremes in every direction. It's bad. I mean, like, look, right. I'm old enough. I think maybe you guys or some of you guys in the audience are or not. It's like no one wants to go back to mall culture, right? Where like everyone shops at the Gap and like gives like 6 choices and like eats whatever, like Wetzel's pretzels, and like the internet's awesome. Like you can do the niches, the fact that you can kind of express yourself, and like people can find their communities, and like they can be super small and niche interests. It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing that people can follow their passions that deeply. But I think like push to the ultimate extreme, right? If you let raffle all the way down on that, it's just very dangerous and challenging for nations, right? It's very dangerous and challenging for us, agreeing on anything. It empowers cult leaders to a ridiculous level, right? Which, can be fine if those cult leaders are benevolent or like they're aligned with everyone else, and really challenging if they're not, right? And so I think, these are not easy problems. And I also think you can't just throw up your hands and say, well, we should ban stuff or have opinions. I think the real thing for me is like, you can have opinions, but you also have to acknowledge that like technology is technology, and like it's going to march in a certain direction based on like pretty fundamental information physics. And so the question then is like, all right, like how do you design better systems, right, that help us get along, right, and help us like find community on a healthy scale and things like that.
One thing that's interesting about what you were saying with, whether these cults are basically push society apart, where everyone, it's all sort of like isolated into a bunch of different silos. Like I've got the people that I listen to on Clubhouse, the Substacks that I read, whatever group chats or, Discords that I'm in, and that's kind of it. And there's no more sort of global shared space. There does seem to be an acceleration of people, basically cults just going to war with each other because it's exciting and fun and it attracts new adherents. And
totally.
It's sort of like there is sort of like this force pulling people back together, but it seems to be almost like a purely negative force. It's coming together on the battlefield rather than coming together like at like, a table or whatever. And like, I mean, a great example of it is like, take the New York Times tweet about Clubhouse that was like unfettered conversations are happening on Clubhouse. If you look at the original usage in the article, it's not great. Like I don't love the original quote, but it has a different sense. Like the meaning of it feels substantially different to me than the way it came out in the tweet. And so, people of course will react to the tweet, in a sort of appropriate way, but then they'll ascribe a lot of blame to like the writers, and then, the writers will feel triggered, and then they'll say something, and it's like this cascading, like mutual triggering cycle, basically, where no one is their best self when they're being defensive, usually. And so I think the cults kind of have this tendency to go to war, and I'm curious how you think we could solve for that, maybe with some better design.
Well, yeah, I mean, cult for sure. War sells. Like that's how you get more adherents. That's how you like let your adherents expose. I mean, the GameStop thing is a great example of this, right? Like, war is exciting. It's interesting. I mean, it's good. It's not physical war, right? It used to be like cults would go to physical war. And like, I think general information and content war is better. I just think people have to like, it's interesting. I'll tell you my potential way out of it. This is the best answer I have, which I love. So apparently, and again, someone who's a history buff can correct me on the details here, but like there was this era in British history where they invented gin, right? And basically the entire society was just drunk for like 100 years, right? And like GDP dropped and it was like a complete disaster. And
wow.
like,
what did they have before it?
I don't know, something that was like less potent. Again, someone who knows the actual history. It was basically the upshot is like you get more potent alcohol. People just are like addicted to it and they get super drunk, and like it's a total societal disaster. Like birth rates dropped, like it's like you can just imagine a drunk society for a century. But like the Brits still drink too much, but they basically grew out of it, right? And like I kind of think that like the only way that I am sure that we can kind of grow out of this is like, look, we have been totally shocked as a system by the internet. Like we're all first generation internet citizens in a lot of ways. There'll be a few more generations. People are going to be super drunk on it. They're going to love their cults, right? At a certain point, you're like, chill out. Like, and I think that actually could happen to some degree, where it's just like, look, it's like, I don't even know the New York Times quote tweet you're referring to, but here's the deal. Are there unfettered conversations that are ephemeral and probably pretty dangerous and bad if people coming together on Clubhouse? Yeah, of course. Like, duh. Like, if you open up like an audio chat room that's like not moderated and let people pull adherents into it because they're only talking to their audience and their cult, right? Because the way the push notifications, whatever works, like the more private this goes, yeah, they're going to be crazy, right? It's like everyone like yells at Facebook news feed as being like this place where like bad stuff happens. Here's the thing. That's only because you can see it. Like if you could see the stuff that was going on in private chat messages, you'd be way more scared. Right. And so like, yes, of course the technology does that. It also does a bunch of good stuff, right? Like you have to just I think people need to have like a more moderate understanding of this stuff, which is like, yes, like the answer to all this stuff is yes. And like, let's not be overly crazy about it. It's like, it's kind of
so the path out of this is basically just people will grow tired of it.
Yeah. Like you just get bored of being drunk, or you just get like bored of like outrage, right? Is my hope, right? Right now, outrage is really fun. It sells. It creates value. I mean, it creates. At some point, people just be like, "Look, you've literally gone as far as you can with the extremeness thing." It's like I'm blind to it. Like everything is so extreme. It's like whatever. Like let's move on and be like moderate humans and adults about this.
Right, totally. There are definitely cycles of these things. It's almost like movies or music or whatever. Like in order to have something that feels fresh and exciting, it has to feel a little bit different. And so if there's like, decades where nobody really makes like a musical and then La La Land comes out, it's like it can be a sort of mediocre musical, but the fact that it's a musical and like modern is like enough to make it stand out, and people go crazy over it or whatever. And so things evolve.
I mean, I think there's also like another good example of this. I always think that like porn is like really interesting because it like is usually ahead of everything else in terms of like where things are. Like, if you look at like what's happened, like porn and OnlyFans and like the direction on this stuff, like a few trends are interesting. One is like it just keeps getting more weird and extreme, right? And you're like, why? Like part of it's like all these niche communities that have like niche fetishes or whatever. Part of it is just like you get bored of normal porn, and so like it has to keep getting more extreme and weird in some direction.
The hedonic treadmill.
Yeah, and like, but at a certain point, you're just like, this is just like, it all just becomes a noise. Like you're completely desensitized to it. It's like right now, it's like with OnlyFans, like, the most interesting thing is like connectivity and like relationships with like it's all about the chat, right? Like it's supposed to be like, oh my god, these are like real people. Like this is so avant-garde and cool, right? These like weird niche communities. But like I think at a certain point, people are gonna be like, oh wait a minute. These chats are all being written by like people in India and like farms, and it's not that interesting, right? And like you just kind of get bored of it, right? And so I think, I don't know, that's again, it goes back to this whole like I think the route out is not the technology changing, it's like us growing up to some degree.
Right.
Really interesting. I also want to go deeper on something that you had mentioned earlier, which is about financing for creators and investing in creators and people. I'd love to hear your thoughts on like what the right financing model is for these creators as
I'll tell you, and if
there's businesses.
Yeah, so I have strong opinions about this, and I'm actually very actively working on this. So like, for instance, if anyone is a creator and wants to talk to me about this or is interested, please reach out. This is like a very active project for me. But to me, here's what's going to happen. Right now, we're in this phase where all these creators are like creating businesses, right? And so they can't really finance the creator. You finance like the business the creator started. And that's because like we know how to do that and think about that. We all know that like creator backed things get like tons of free distribution and like whatever else, right? And so like that's kind of, I don't think that's right. I think the future is actually just me directly investing in the future earnings of creators, which is kind of like an ISA model, except for here's the big difference. ISAs are usually like effectively like modified debt instruments. You like pay back for a certain period. If you don't make enough money, you don't pay, fine. I think the way it goes is much more like, look, I buy a percentage, 1%, 3% of all of a creator's projects, of all of their future earnings for like 30 or 40 years, like their entire lifespan. And then I also get effectively the IP of the brands they create on an ongoing basis. That then aligns me completely with the creator. I'm like, here's some capital. Do what you need. Like you want to use it to grow your audience. You want to use it to hire the best people, all the stuff you can't do right now. You should, right? Like you should invest in your brand and building you. And then how you monetize is really hard to know over the next 30 years. You might build a product, you might, build a company, you might have a subscription service, you might do ads. Like it's going to keep evolving. I actually think it's a great thing for investors because you're like, look, there's so much money in the world. And it's so uncertain. I definitely want to invest in like people and their trusted communities directly. And that's really great. And I think for the creator, it's like, rather than it being like, look, I can't really get access to the money I need to grow right now. So like I have to grow off cash flow, which then creates a bunch of problems. Or like I'm going to start a bunch of businesses which aren't fully authentic to me. It's more like, no. Like your brand, your trust, like your network, your cult, right, is the business. And like, let's just do this directly. So I see a bright future where like you basically have a whole capital stack around people, much like you do on companies right now. Like I want to do seed investing. Like I would love to spend $20 million next year directly on investing in creators, right? And I'm actually actively working on this. And then like you're going to have for bigger creators, formats where they can, it's kind of like a late stage company, right? In a lot of ways, where they might get huge valuations from the private markets for what they're doing. They might use capital to invest in the next generation, right? And say like, okay, like I'm a huge fitness influencer. I'm going to like seed the next 5 fitness influencers and help them grow. And then I expect there'll be a public market as well. Like, I expect there to be many multi-billion-dollar influencer brands that are publicly listed that their fans can buy into. You can talk about how that ends up working. But like, yeah, I've always been bullish on this space broadly. But I'm like very actively working on this right now because I think it's the future and I think it's time for it.
It's fascinating to me because it feels like I could imagine a scenario where the competitive frontier for a lot of types of new products is like you have to launch through an influencer in order for it to break out. Because like, for instance, there's just so many influencers that are trying to launch so many things that on average, if they can have something with a good enough value proposition that stands on its own, then it's just better if it's going to take off faster if it launches through someone with a community than kind of coming from out of nowhere. So like, there are some models like whatever, Clubhouse or Instagram or whatever, where it's like, there are definitely some early influential users and there's a lot of intentionality in that early community, but it wasn't like Dispo where it's like David Dobrik's app, who like he built a team and all this stuff. And with Dispo, if it's going to work in the long run, it's going to have to be because Dispo had some functionality that is just generally useful. But maybe in the future, there's like 4 dispos and they all have like some similar mechanic and they work really well, but just the one that happened to be launched through the influencer wins because it gets to community the fastest and gets the flywheel going the fastest. And there's some path dependency there.
Cheap customer acquisition in this day and age, right? Because like a trusted person that's authentic is like doing it is like a huge advantage. Like it's a huge, and like I think being on monetize that's huge. The other thing in mind is like, look, it used to be that like business platforms were pretty scarce, right? So the dynamic used to be like, okay, you're like Nike, you can make sweet shoes. You might pay Michael Jordan a lot of money, but the reality is you don't have to pay him that much money. I mean, you pay him a lot to be clear, but like there are other people that you could decide to promote the shit out of, right? Like there are other people you could build up the brand and the identity around. Like, there's like the market, it's like more of a competitive market in talent than it is a competitive market in like making awesome shoes. This is inverted now, right? Like most company services like are pretty commoditized on a relative basis, right? And so, so because they're pretty commoditized on a relative basis, in some ways it's like you're LeBron, or I'm not good at basketball, whoever the next LeBron is, and like you're like, look, I'm either gonna go to Nike or Adidas or whatever. Like I don't really fucking care, right? Like I'm the scarce commodity, right? I have the direct relationship with my fans. Someday like the LeBron 6.0 bot, right, is going to like be able to like really directly have a relationship with everyone and last forever because you're never going to age, right? So like you have all these like factors that make the talent and the relationship and the brand the valuable thing, and like the ability to make pretty good shoes like secondary, if that makes sense. And I think that's to do like, as much with like business platforms commoditizing as it does with like celebrity and creators just like getting really deep relationships with their communities.
Yeah, I remember when you describe this kind of model of investing in creators, it reminds me of, I recall that there were a few startups maybe a few years ago that were trying to do this by investing into like young, ambitious people at the start of their careers. Maybe they were saddled with student debt and just like couldn't really do the most ambitious thing that they wanted to do. But my recollection is that those models never really took off, and there was maybe some adverse selection of the folks who felt like they were onto great things, didn't really want to give up a portion of their future income. So I'm curious what you think
that's
changes.
for sure. That's for sure true. I mean, like, there's been a bunch of experiments with this for like 20 or 30 years. Like, again, like literally in like 1999, like you can go look it up on Google patent search. It's like you can find my like high school patents on like funding marketplaces for people, right? And like before that, there's the historical example of like Bowie bonds, and like Yale University ran like the 90s an experiment where they said rather than paying us in cash, they'll take a percentage of your income for a while to like pay back loans. Here's the thing. I think no one's been bold enough with this, honestly, right? They've always been like, okay, it's basically like a form of a loan, or like there's some caps to it. And like, it's not like a real venture. No one's actually done the real venture capital model of it, right? Is my view. And I think that's kind of like one of the big failings so far. The adverse selection problem is interesting and challenging. I mean, I will say that like ISAs, for instance, income sharing agreements, it's not a great time to be doing ISAs because there's 0% interest rates, right? Like there's too much, like there is a problem, right? Like when effectively the competitive products are basically free. It still works, and there's still a place for them in my mind with private institutions, and especially like when there's like coding schools, which is where they got big, because everyone's like, I don't know if this program's any good. Like, I'm not really willing to pay a shitload of money for this, but I guess like we can share risk. So like there's still a future there, but like there's been a bunch of historical challenges. But yeah, I still think it's the right model long term. I still think in the long term, even you take young people, the model might not be, you go get $100,000 or like you get it, like it might be instead like, which I've seen people working on, people trying, is like, all right, like your 10 kids, friends graduating together, there's randomness in life. You're not exactly sure which one of you will succeed. So you like pool income in a way, right? Like formally, right? We're like, cool, like let's all throw in 5% of what we make. Someone's going to do really well. We're not sure which of the startups will work, but that's okay. Cause like, we're kind of like doing like a hedged insurance product around that. But look, I mean,
and there is a company doing that.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there's a few, for instance, for what it's worth. So it's not like, and again, it's not a novel idea. It's just one of those things that's like, it's a little weird. It's new. People don't you have to have like a real incentive to want to go do it. A lot of life is not about like, it's just about doing shit, because like the ideas are there, but like, it's actually really hard work and like challenging to actually do the things, right? But look, I mean, biggest picture, here's the deal. Companies used to be huge monoliths. Technology makes things super liquid. It makes firms that can be way, way, way smaller, right? And units can be smaller. Like we're seeing this happen where like the unit of business is an individual, whether it's Substack or like OnlyFans or whatever. Like that is the direction we're going in. Like I'm too old, but apparently like Gen Z like looks down on like my generation for even having jobs. Like it's very déclassé to like work at a company, right? And so like that's the direction we're heading. The question is, how does capital follow that? How does infrastructure follow that? Everything else.
Right. I'm curious. The thing you mentioned earlier about why the previous experiments with funding people hadn't succeeded is they weren't bold enough. What are some of the concrete differences where it's like some of the terms that you think should have been changed?
My version of the world, if you are investing in a person, you own a percentage of what they do forever. Everyone's always hesitated at this. Like, oh, that's like really scary. That forever is a big word. It's like, I want to do it for 5 years or something. But the problem is, if you do it for 5 years or 10 years or whatever, if you ever do really well, you just avoid ever paying out on it. Like I talk about it as like the Jeff Bezos problem. It's like, let's pretend you had an ISA on Jeff Bezos. You know how much you'd make on that? 0, right? Jeff Bezos just borrows money when he needs it. He might be the world's richest man, but it's not like he has a huge amount of income. Like it's really easy to not have income if you don't want to have income. And so my view is like, look, if you're able to say I can capture the Jeff Bezos upside, then I can actually charge everyone else way less, right? This is the venture capital model. Like I don't mind that like 9 out of 10 people don't pan out, right? When I buy equity companies, because the 10th pays for everyone else. And like I actually think you want your super winners to be able to pay for everyone else and structure it that way. You just have to get people in the mindset of like, yeah, look, I kind of already have an ISA with the government. Like you already have an ISA with the government for 55% of your income, right? Like, if it's 57 because you're like paying back into this pool of capital that helped you get started, like that's fine to me. I just think it's a big mental leap for some people, right? But it is really important. is like the boldness component to it.
Right. That was the thing when I was at Substack and we were talking about how do we make, I mean, one form of helping people get started on Substack is just an advance where it's like you can make 1x basically. And it's a way to activate someone who, you know, we're almost certain will succeed, and we're going to lose money sometimes, but it'll have been worth it as like a marketing expense or whatever, because the winners, the big winners, they're still basically just paying us back 1x. The model that I was very interested in is how do we make a lot more than 1x on the winners, and then we can seed a much wider variety of writers, some of whom will unexpectedly do amazing and some of whom will be flops unexpectedly, and because we just don't know, there's uncertainty, and so you want to be able to really have your winners drive a lot of success and be able to pay for the not winners. And when I was there, we didn't figure out that model. I don't know what they're doing now, but I think that's a really important principle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, look, I think Substack, not to go TV one, but you know, I'm friends with Hamish, and like I think it's a great platform, and you know, I obviously have affinity for the idea from a long time ago. Is like, I think the biggest problem is just like I don't really know how you make margin long term, right? When like your biggest people will all just kind of graduate off of you, right? Unless you're charging like 0% on everything, in which case like it's hard to make money, right? Like I think it's hard to be the infrastructure provider for this stuff personally, right? Like I think that's like the ultimate problem. Doesn't mean it's not a great service, doesn't mean it doesn't have a place, doesn't mean it can't be a good business, but like to be like a really big business, like that's the question. I think there could be answers like in terms of like, but like that, I think that's the problem, right? If that makes sense.
Totally.
To your question, Nathan, of what would be that model if not advances, I've always thought that there could be a really interesting business to be built, kind of like a lifestyle business though, because it's not that scalable, of identifying and theorizing what are the gaps in the Substack ecosystem. Like what are the newsletters that don't exist that you think should exist? Like what are the topics to be covered? And then going out, finding those writers, pulling them out of their day jobs, funding them upfront, and like in exchange for some sort of ISA.
Interesting. I mean, we kind of do that. That's like kind of what Every does.
Yeah, that is what Every does.
True.
I mean, I think yeah, and like I think it's generally, I mean, good. Look, I think the problem with a lot of stuff with this long form writing stuff, I say this as someone who writes long form content, and my wife, I would argue, was pretty influential in like pushing the narrative of like subscription journalism. I mean, when she launched The Information, everyone made fun of her. Literally, there were articles being like, "This is ridiculous." Like people were making fun of her in the media industry, and you know, she's like an enormous business and growing, like doing high quality paid journalism. But like, I do think that there's a problem, which is kind of the opposite of the Facebook problem, is like there's just too much long form content now, right? Like it's just unprocessable. Like I don't even subscribe to that many Substacks, but it's just like too much to read, right? And so like I think, I don't know, there's a long history of bundling and unbundling and how you deal with this problem, but like it, you know, the wheel turns yet again for sure.
Right. My theory on that is that you have to compete on quality, because people definitely do want to read, but they want to go to the place where they can get the highest quality stuff. And so if we can help, like as a solo writer, it's really hard to produce like 4 things a week that people actually want to read.
Yep.
You know, and there's a lot of newsletters that are really popular that publish 4 things a week. And I'm very curious what % of their subscriber base actually reads all those things, or for how long they actually read all those things. But if you can have a bundle of writers where each writer gets to spend like 2 weeks maybe on something, or like a month even, where it's like a little bit more like the New Yorker model, right? Where it's like they have a stable of writers that, you know, are aggregated together. I think it can make a lot of sense, but just, you know, the New Yorker only writes really about a very specific kind of thing. And I'm interested in different topics, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree with you, obviously.
Should we switch to Q&A with the audience?
Yeah, let's do it.
This is the cult moment. This is the cult moment. You guys have your power.
We get to hand select and utilize our power to decide.
And remember, because you get to utilize your power, then basically like there's like this weird adherence thing that goes like, go. This is so fun. Enjoy the cult.
And by the way, everyone should subscribe to our culty newsletter. Every.to.
This is an opportune moment to do a really quick plug before we have more people speaking. So this is brought to you by Every, the thing we were just talking about. And you should go to every.to and find Means of Creation, which is this. We do Means of Creation. Now we're actually going to start doing it twice a week because Clubhouse rewards frequency. And we just honestly love being here. And so we're going to do Tuesdays and Thursdays as opposed to just Fridays. And we have a written version of this that comes out once a week where we really break down a lot of the recent news, and Lee and I give our opinions and takes. But Adam, how's it going? Good to see you again.
Great to see you guys. Thanks, Nathan and Lee and Sam. And I missed